You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal Fire Ecology, and today we have a very, very special guest giving a very, very special podcast about a particular paper that was the closing plenary paper at the 10th International Fire Ecology and Management Conference. The paper's title is called Coexisting with Wildfire, Strengthening Collective Capacity by Changing the Status Quo. And we are honored here to have Christine Eriksen as the primary and senior author of this paper. And she is with us now. Christina, hello, how are you?
Good morning, Bob. I'm well, thanks. Thanks for the invitation to join you.
Well, we are certainly proud to have you. Can you tell us where you're from and your affiliation?
Yes, so a little bit about me. I am a fire social scientist. I started researching fire as a land management tool in Africa as a geography student in the early 2000s. And that led to a PhD in Australia, which sharpened my interest in social dimensions of disaster. And really the pivotal moment was the devastating 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. They happened just as I was finishing my PhD. And that shaped the next 10 years of my research at the University of Wollongong in Australia. But I then relocated from Australia to Switzerland in 2020 to work in a university-based think tank where I advised the Swiss government on how to adapt to climate-exacerbated hazards. And I was then awarded a consolidator grant by the Swiss National Science Foundation to focus on community wildfire resilience in Europe. And that's what I'm currently doing as a research professor at the University of Bern.
Well, we at Fire Ecology have been reading your papers and watching you for a while. And this paper particularly struck a great note because it's a wonderful time in fire ecology that we're trying to embrace everyone and increase diversity. So could you give us a quick summary of what the paper is all about?
Absolutely. Well, maybe it's good to give a little insight to why I wrote the paper before I get into what it's about, because it really sums up 20 odd years of my research. I have always sought to give voice to everyday lives and the realities of living and working with fire in my research. And that's often meant examining the trade-offs people make between risks and benefits in different contexts. And one of the findings in my research is that disasters are social phenomena. So more often than not, what makes people vulnerable is exposure to socially constructed risks, be that in the form of poor urban planning or inadequate knowledge or historical and structural injustices. So I strive to open up novel conversations about socially diverse people and how they experience exposure, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity differently due to social and structural inequalities. And the Association for Fire Ecology gave me an opportunity to have such a conversation by inviting me to give the closing plenary you mentioned before in December 2023. And so the outcome is this paper. The paper is important because it shows how everyone who is a part of the wildland fire profession can strengthen our collective capacity to coexist with wildfire by noticing inequity and by taking proactive steps towards inclusive, enabling, and sustainable working conditions. And it's also important because it highlights the way we as individuals and as a society tend to willfully ignore issues that undermine essential progress. So what I did in this paper is I examined three particular social and structural issues that underpin many of the current struggles we are facing in the wildland fire profession. The first is a long and troublesome history of marginalizing indigenous people and their fire stewardship practices. The second is a toxic patriarchal workplace culture that discriminates against women, BIPOC, and LGBTIQ plus people. And the third is an exodus of wildland firefighters from the workforce due to the longer and harder fire seasons that make the workload, the poor pay, and lack of social benefits unsustainable. And I then focus on privilege to explain explain why instead of making the wholesale social and structural changes needed to embrace indigenous stewardship practices, to enable workforce diversity and inclusive leadership, and to provide sustainable working conditions for wildland firefighters, we tend to still put these issues in the quote-unquote too hard basket. We willfully ignore them, or we proactively fight to stop such change.
So in the paper, what did you find, and why are your findings important to the greater fire science community?
So the paper demonstrates that while generational knowledge, cultural diversity, and interdisciplinarity provide the answers needed for vital change, history also shows how certain generations, certain cultures, and certain disciplines inherit taken for granted privileges that give them a vested interest in either maintaining the status quo or changing some things but not others. And it's difficult to change such privilege because until recently, many dominant groups have rarely been challenged to think about their own dominance, let alone made to understand how their dominance is based on advantages and why relinquishing such advantages will benefit all of society. And to do so requires individual and collective noticing of what is wrong and everyday action steps towards equity. So these results are important because the status quo of wildland firefighting is so blatantly inadequate in the face of a both demographically and climatically altered world. By diversifying our workforce and empowering leaders to support such diversity, we can transform privilege and inhibiting social norms. So large-scale programmatic and policy changes and infrastructure investments, they're all important in calling out problematic dynamics and influencing political and institutional change. But to truly intervene in what is wrong also requires noticing it is wrong in an everyday context, and that we must all do, regardless of where we work or live.
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. So how hard is it going to be to employ or integrate these solutions that you put in your paper?
That's a good question. I think many people are quite daunted by the thought of changing the status quo. But in the final part of the paper, I build on the work of the climate leader, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, to take a joyful approach to climate action. And I do that in the form of a Venn diagram with 3 intersecting circles. And what this emphasizes is that most of us are likely most powerful in our existing roles where we have specialized knowledge and robust networks. And if we identify what we are good at, what work needs doing, and what brings us joy, then we should actively seek to act where our individual answers intersect in this Venn diagram. And so what this highlights is that noticing is a really important precursor for caring. And caring in turn is a really key part of providing incentive for proactively creating change in our everyday lives. And so if each and every one of us intervene in what is wrong by noticing it is wrong, and all of us take steps in our everyday lives to create an even playing field by doing what we are good at and supporting others to do the same, we will strengthen our collective capacity to cope with the heavy toll that wildfires are taking on both our physical and mental well-being.
Yeah, that is really well said. Thank you for that. I know that AFI, the Association for Fire Ecology, has a committee, the diversity committee, that is working hard to make sure that that is happening in our sphere of the world in fire science. So is there anything else, Christina, you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
It might be worth noting, just as a closing comment, that many privileged people find it confronting to be told that the social conditioning that made them who they are is inhibiting progress within the profession or the workforce that they care deeply about. And so one white male fire professional frustratedly asked after hearing my keynote, "What, so am I supposed to just sit back and do nothing?" And it's important to emphasize this is not what I'm saying in this paper. I recognize that many privileged people do not intentionally discriminate. The dominant status has simply never made them aware of how deeply ingrained white gendered structures are in operational procedures and cultural norms to an extent that they're debilitating. So what I am saying in this paper is that we all have a role to play in noticing what is wrong and enabling diversity and inclusion that makes us all stronger. And that for some, this will involve giving up certain cultural advantages.
Right. Well, again, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This is an incredibly interesting paper and an incredibly interesting podcast. Thank you so much, Christina.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. You can get this paper for free at the Fire Ecology website hosted by Springer Nature. You can download it today, as you can with all the publications that Fire Ecology produces. I'd like to say thank you, Christine Eriksen, and thank you for everyone for listening, and we'll see you back next time.